This is my video on how bad power creep is in every card game. So power creep. The idea of power creep is when you take a card and then you're going to print a newer version of that card that is strictly better than the previous version. Sort of. It's also when you have a card that is powerful and sees play in a metagame, and then you're going to replace that with a newer version of a card that isn't exactly the same but serves a similar purpose, therefore kicking out the previous card. Once again, sort of. Power creep can also be when you have a deck that comes out that is more powerful than previous decks, therefore pushing those previous decks that used to be strong out of the metagame. All of these kind of revolve around the same idea, which is a new card coming out that's going to push out an old either card or strategy that used to be viable and that will no longer be playable thanks to the new card. That's what power creep is. But in general, there's some important things that you need to know about power creep. And one is that power creep is required for games for them to keep up their player base. If you don't print new cards that people are going to want to get, that means you're not going to have enough people playing in your game and getting into your game from new perspectives. So power creep is important to keep your game fluid and continuing to print sets over and over again. Power creep is just required. It also must be handled with a lot of care, because if you have too much power creep inputted into your game can drastically warp and change to a way that you wouldn't want it to be. Power creep is a lot of fun though, which is why we see it a lot. If you're playing a deck with a card that you love a lot, and then you have a new card from the new set that comes out that is also powerful and slots right into the deck that you were already playing, you're going to have a great time. However, power creep is also dangerous, because in the same idea, let's say you have a card that you love playing in your deck that you've been playing for a long time, and then a new card comes out that completely encapsulates what your card does, but is simply better. Therefore, you no longer get to play with that old card that you used to like to play with a lot, because you'll be forced to play the new card in the better version in your deck, or you simply will be at a disadvantage for playing the older version of the card, being a very dangerous effect. One more thing though, power creep is very lucrative, which is another reason you're going to see it in a lot of card games. You have a card here that is going to be seeing play a lot in lots of different formats, and it's going to be powerful, and then you're going to replace that with a better card. That card is newer, and therefore you have to buy either new versions of the card, which will cost more, or you'll need to buy packs in order to get the new card, also generating money for whatever card game you are playing. So power creep is a lucrative way for them to make you have to spend money on newer cards. This way, power creep can feel kind of draining on players, either feeling like all of their old cards basically serve no purpose after new cards come out to replace them, or they feel like their wallet is being stretched by cards coming out that they're forced to buy over and over again over a game's lifespan. Now, let's talk a bit about power creep in Magic. So Magic, in the beginning of the game, spells were super duper powerful and were definitely the strongest thing that you could do in the game. There was a lot less powerful creatures. Most of the strong creatures were just good stats for the cost and didn't really have a lot of keywords or anything about them. You would just kind of play them down to do the actual killing of your opponent, whereas the spells would give you the gas and the power and the card draw that you would need to actually finish out the game. So as time has progressed, the spells have been toned down in power a little bit, been brought back to what is a little bit slower in comparison to the old spells of yesteryear. Most spells nowadays do something a little bit more reasonable and have a little bit less value for their costs, whereas creatures have only gained since that time. Most creatures don't have downsides anymore, and the creatures that had no text have oftentimes gained a bunch of text that makes them a little more applicable in multiple scenarios, like Dauntless Bodyguard here gaining a line of text to protect your creatures in the late game rather than just being an early game threat. Now, there is a little strategy that Magic has been pulling recently. It has both for the last few sets, where they just put good spell effects on the creatures to make it so that way not only are you getting the good effect from the spell when you play the creature, but you also get the creature to help you finish out the game. Examples like Uro, which comes down here and has an enter the battlefield effect that also triggers when it attacks, that gives you 3 life, a card, and lets you put a land into play. That's basically just a spell on its own, not to mention its escapability lets you recur it over and over again, getting more copies of the spell going on. Similar card here with Omnath, Locust Creation. Both these cards got banned for similar reasons. You play them down, they have an enter the battlefield effect that gives you back the value from the card that you played. They're a big body, meaning they can easily kill your opponent, and they have an effect that recurs over the course of the game. Landfall, being able to trigger multiple times per turn, giving you many effects such as life gain, mana, and damage to your opponent. Not to mention that Omnath is super powerful on the board if you leave it, because you can recur landfall again and again over the course of your turns. There's also a variety of power creep cards that are simply cards that were not tested enough. Examples here like Luris or Nadu are cards that simply didn't get enough play testing to see if they would be truly broken, or they thought they would be fine on a release, and then once you release the card, because Magic is a paper game, you can't really errata the cards or nerf the cards in any way. Luris is an example of a card that got errated, which is super duper rare in Magic and basically never happens because of how broken the companion mechanic ended up being, and Nadu has recently been banned in all the formats it was intended for because they simply didn't test the card enough, meaning that these are more freak accidents and outliers compared to regular power creep that would expect over the course of a card game's lifetime. Also, Power creep is true in all card games, and you're going to see this in everyone, but push stats are the most obvious indicator of power creep happening in your game, and the most obvious thing that you can see is here on Shieldred, which is a 4/5 for 4 mana in black. Normally, flat black creatures in the olden days with push stats would have to have some sort of downside on them to make up for the fact that they have good stats and they cost low mana. However, Shieldred here has a huge upside of gaining you life and dealing your opponent damage over the course of the game, not to mention that the body is huge and can easily kill your opponent in 1 to 2 swings with her ability in combination. So Shieldred, great example of push power creep over the course of Magic's lifespan. Power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a bit different. Much like Magic, the spells in old Yu-Gi-Oh! Basically, they had a spell for absolutely everything. They were super broken, and the creatures in Yu-Gi-Oh! The best thing you could do in early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was just to summon whatever the biggest 4-star guy was and beat your opponent to death with it, because the spells were so good, it wasn't worth investing in anything larger. You would just play the biggest guy that you could possibly play for one normal summon and beat your opponent to death with it. Now, over the course of Yu-Gi-Oh!, more and more cards came out, starting here with Cyber Dragon, which were, creatures that you could summon that have a special summoning requirement built into them. So Cyber Dragon allowed you to summon from your hand if your opponent controls a monster and you control no monsters, which isn't such a large effect that it was impossible to do. However, you got a relatively large size body for basically no cost to your normal summon because you could special summon Cyber Dragon. Spells were also made very pushed still over the course of Yu-Gi-Oh! However, they were given archetype-specific requirements. So, for example, Sky Striker Mobilize Engage here. If you look at this card, it requires you to have no monsters in your main monster zones, and it also requires you to have 3 spells in your graveyard to activate both halves of its effect. Meaning that if you use Sky Striker Mobilize Engage, you will have to build your deck around the card, forcing you to play it in specific archetypes. This lets you still play with the powerful spell effects that you want to use, however, you have to also jump through a couple hoops to make it work in your deck. Now, because of the special summoning of monsters like Cyber Dragon and more examples that we see in the future, the only real gate to your deck being the normal summon has been removed from Yu-Gi-Oh!, meaning that you can basically summon as many guys as you want on your turn as long as they only require special summons. So this leads to cards like Dark-Armed Dragon or the Dragon Rulers, which are super powerful cards that have somewhat of an archetype limiter, meaning that you have to either play dragons or darks in your deck to actually play them out for free. However, these cards are super powerful boss monsters that summon themselves for completely free, meaning they can slam down as early as turn 1, or whenever you end up drawing them, you can play this massive guy down that has a huge impact on the game, basically whenever you have them. Also, the extra deck is introduced over the course of Yu-Gi-Oh!'s lifespan, where usually it was just used for fusion monsters in the beginning of the game. Now it has cards like Synchros, XYZs, and it also has Link Summons, which are all different summoning mechanics that you can use from your extra deck. So if you have any guys in play, you can either use an archetype-specific summon to summon a specific archetype boss monster for your archetype, or you can summon a random generic guy that can have a powerful effect, like all these ones here, that only require specific monsters, not specific types of monsters or specific attributes of monsters. Just any 2 monsters can combine into these powerful effects. All roads in Yu-Gi-Oh! Also lead to banning because Yu-Gi-Oh! Has no set rotation, meaning that if any of the special summoning mechanics or spell mechanics end up treading over the line in a specific archetype, they have no choice but to ban cards out from that archetype, which is why Yu-Gi-Oh! Out of all the card games has had as many tier 1 formats as it has, meaning that one deck is so much stronger than the other decks because archetypes are making it so that way decks are very specific and have very powerful tools, and other decks cannot splash tools that those archetypes have because of the power inherent in those archetypes. Powercreep in Hearthstone, very similar, but it has a few differences from the start of the game because Hearthstone is a bit newer than the other games. So you have cards like Wild Growth and SI7 Agent in the base set that are powerful, but kind of represent what classes want to do. Because classes don't really overlap in Hearthstone the same way it would in Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic or Pokemon, where you can play any cards in your deck that you want. This means they can print specific things for specific classes, giving you that identity built into the class itself. Now, the problem with original Hearthstone was that it wasn't really random enough. It was very consistent, and a lot of games ended up playing the exact same way. So they started in the first expansion to release cards that did a random amount of damage, or summoned a random amount of guys, or summoned a random amount of things. This way, there would be more variance in the type of gameplay. But this feels really bad as the player to experience on the other end if you get hit randomly by an implosion that does 4 instead of 2, losing you the game. So Hearthstone decides to introduce a little bit more of Discover. So Discover being a mechanic that gives you a random selection of cards, however you get to pick from the random selection, meaning that you have a little bit more control over what card you're specifically going to end up getting, which feels a lot better as the player. There are also big, powerful effects that get printed that have a bit of randomness built in, but also have a bit of a deck building requirement. So Mysterious Challenger here requires you to have a bunch of secrets in your deck, giving you an interesting deck building choice, meaning how many secrets do you want to put in your deck, which secrets do you want to play, and how likely are you to draw Mysterious Challenger before you draw your secrets. Depending on how many secrets you put in will depend on when you draw the Mysterious Challenger and when it works on this most powerful effect. Overall card quality also increases over the course of Hearthstone's lifespan, which is doubly powercrept in Hearthstone because not only does the power level of the cards in your deck increase, but the random cards that you will get over the course of the game, power levels also goes up, meaning that in general, discovering a random card only gets better along with the cards getting better in the game. The same theming kind of happens over the course of the later years. It's just a little bit changed. So Scarab Keychain is another example of a Discover card that you'll see that still sees play even today. Compared to old Discover cards, it just plays down a guy that gives you a body and gives you a Discover. Portalmancer Skyla is a big spell mage payoff that swaps low and high cost card spells in your hand, letting you cast a high cost spell for very cheap. Similar to Mysterious Challenger, this has deck building requirements, forcing you to play high and low cost spells to be able to swap them. This is another example of basically how Hearthstone has worked throughout the history. All the decks are specific to classes and specific to different archetypes in their own way. Also, there's been more nerfs happening over the course of Hearthstone's lifespan as it gets further into the future and the game balance gets more out of whack. It's a lot harder to balance your game the more cards you add into it, and the more different random elements you add into it makes it harder to predict what cards will be too powerful. So more nerfs happening over the course of the game's lifespan makes a lot of sense as the game has grown in power over time. Powercreep in Pokemon is a lot different, if you ask me. You do still have the same thing as we had in Magic and in Yu-Gi-Oh, where the guys at the beginning, this is the strongest guy we had, Hitmonchan. He's just 70 HP, has a basic attack, has a pretty expensive retreat cost. But the spells, or trainers as they're called, the Pokemon, are super powerful. Computer search, super good. You can discard 2 cards and then get any card you possibly could want in your entire deck, put in your hand. Obviously super strong. Now, over the years, they have kind of flipped the script on this, whereas the Pokemon have gotten a lot stronger, they've gotten abilities, they've gotten more damage, they've gotten more HP. Only things in Pokemon that go up are the numbers on the Pokemon, so you can see that having an extra 50 health, but basically the exact same cost on the new Hitmonchan card compared to the old one. It's interesting what they did with the items, though. A lot of the powerful items, like Computer Search here, became ace-spec cards, which means you can only play 1 copy of it in your deck, and that's of any ace-spec card, not specifically just Computer Search. Meaning that you still get to play with the super powerful card from the olden days, but you only get 1 copy, meaning that you only have 1 time where you can actually use it for its powerful effect. An interesting way of balancing super powerful trainer cards of old, and also other trainer cards came out that are obviously more reasonably powered compared to Computer Search. Now, EX Pokemon was another way that they bumped up the power level of Pokemon. We have Mewtwo EX and Charizard EX. These are 2 different EX Pokemon from 2 very different eras. However, they both have the same requirement where when they are knocked out, your opponent gets to take 2 prize cards. However, as a cost for this, they both deal extra damage compared to normal and also have a much higher HP stat than normal, meaning they can usually take multiple hits, or if they can't take multiple hits, they can knock out multiple Pokemon over the course of the game because of their powerful attacks. This kind of changes the pace and the rules around how fast Pokemon is supposed to go, because in general, it was really hard to take more than 1 KO per turn in the older Pokemon days. However, with the introduction of EX Pokemon and other Pokemon that force your opponent to take additional prize cards when they are knocked out, it means that the game kind of speeds up and the focus changes from being about specifically getting 6 prize cards to be getting 6 prize cards in any combination of destroying your opponent's EX Pokemon or knocking out bench Pokemon or sniping down powerful basic Pokemon. Also, it changes a little bit where because of the fact that you are focused on getting specific things, a lot more engines are popping up. Claydol is the one I'm most familiar with, which lets you draw 6 cards from your deck by putting 2 cards from your hand on the bottom if you want. Or you have the new card Pidgeot-EX, which lets you search your deck for any card if you have it in play once per turn. So these 2 engines kind of let you go over the course of the game and draw multiple cards or get specific cards that you need. And this is a little bit more important in Pokemon because you need to knock out your opponent's Pokemon over the course of many turns as opposed to all just one big turn where you get all of your prize cards at the same time. Also, it is rare, but there are disruption cards that have been taking place over the course of Pokemon that have powercrept other things that have generally needed to be banned because of their power level. Cards like Vileplume or Seismitoad EX come down and they disrupt your opponent's abilities to play items, meaning that if you get these guys down early enough, your opponent will literally not be able to do any setting up with any of their item cards, being able to build a board, and you will simply overwhelm them with literally anything because your opponent will simply not be able to do anything with Quaking Punch hitting you or with the Irritating Ball and stopping you from playing any items. in conclusion, I want to talk about one final thing with Pokemon here. So they had a rules overhaul and an early rotation in a very important moment in Pokemon when Sableye and Crobat G were kind of dominating the metagame. So Sableye has Overeager, which basically makes you go first every time if you have Sableye down, and Crobat has Flashbite, which allows you to put 1 damage on your opponent's Pokemon, which doesn't sound super powerful, but these two cards combined led to a lot of early game turn 1 wins from you being able to knock out your opponent's only remaining Pokemon on the very first turn of the game, and because you went first, your opponent couldn't do anything to stop that from happening. So Pokemon completely reworked the game and made it completely different so that way they could preserve the intent of the game to be going over the course of multiple turns. So they stopped you from being able to attack on the first turn. They stopped you from being able to play supporters on the first turn. They stopped you from being able to evolve on the first turn. There are many things they stopped you from being able to do on the first turn of the game, so that way the games would last a minimum amount of turns in comparison to just ending as soon as physically possible. Speed and power have to be kept in check in card games, and I think this overhaul that Pokemon did is a really great example of why you need to keep it in check. If the game gets too fast, oftentimes you'll need to make large, massive changes to what happens to cards and gameplay in general to keep the game balanced. And this is what is super important about keeping in mind when you're seeing power creep happen. As long as your core game remains the same, power creep is okay. Once it pushes over that edge of speed and power, you got to rein it back. Formats also help to diversify the needs of different card game audiences, because when you have a card game over many years, many players are going to have different things that they want from your card game. For example, if you have a really slow format and then you make your game faster because that's what you want for the modern player base, other players may want to go back to that old format. This is something we're seeing a lot in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, with old formats from previous sets being played by people who want a slower form of Yu-Gi-Oh! And the people who want the faster version of Yu-Gi-Oh! Can play the modern format that is being played right now in Yu-Gi-Oh! Today. Thanks for watching the video. Like and subscribe if you want to make the number go bigger on my account, because I like to see it when the number gets bigger. Comment about all the card games I didn't talk about and how Power Creep has affected those games over time. Thanks a lot for watching.